Hello, this is Peter Coughlin, Professor of Strategic Management at NPS. Presumably, most of you who are viewing this, if not all of you, are my Wednesday and Thursday students in the GE 4016 class. As you know, I was able to hold a live class on Tuesday, in which we discussed the DARPA case study as well as the lessons in terms of focus and trade-offs being the essence of strategy. I was not able to hold a live class on Wednesday and Thursday, but I did post online the slides that I'm about to show, which are pretty comprehensive in and of themselves. But I also wanted to make sure that Wednesday and Thursday students didn't miss out in any way, and so I'm recording this presentation of me discussing those slides, of going through those slides, both on the principles and as they reference the DARPA case study, so that your preparation for that case study sort of pays off in some sense, and your questions are answered. It is rather long. In effect, what I'm about to do takes place of normally a 4-hour class. I don't expect to be talking for 4 hours, but it could be longer certainly than my half-hour, 45-minute videos I've recorded before, in which we discuss, for example, the results of a given quiz or something like that, and did not want to take class time for that purpose. For that reason, I'm actually going to, I think, break this up into 3 parts. We'll see, but I'll break this up into parts. And so this is the first part of a multi-part sort of videos that will be available or posted online, discussing the DARPA case study and in particular the key concept of the day, which is the idea of focus and trade-offs, which is ultimately, as I've described, the essence of strategy. So, as initial motivation, as you'll know, the name of the DARPA case study, is one that I've written with Nick Dew and was started by student work. It's still very much a work in progress, and being a perfectionist, I'd love to do much more, and I certainly will. But you'll notice that I've sort of called it, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, but with the question mark that is it becoming the Defense Applied Research Project Agency? And that's certainly at least the motivating question. Maybe not the core question in terms of what really the lessons to get out of this are, but ultimately that is a tension that we have in the case study of DARPA moving by, according to some critics, away from advanced research more towards applied research. But in the end, the reason this case study, I love it so much, is it actually teaches a lot of different concepts, but it particularly teaches very well the concepts of focus and trade-offs and what they mean for strategy. So let's step back a bit before we go into DARPA and just remember where this fits into where we are in the course. This is, of course, the third module of the Strategic Management course. There are 4 modules in the course. Strategic thinking forms the basis, and we take the principles of strategic thinking and apply them throughout all the other modules. And we've completed the external analysis module. We did the Cold Wars case study, we did the USPS case study, the 5 force analysis, etc. And now we are into the internal analysis module. And in fact, this is the last case study in the internal analysis module. And then we will finish up the course by talking about dynamic analysis, right? Change, sustaining advantage, innovation, these sorts of things. All right. So, and by the way, as I hear my dog barking in the background, maybe you don't, but please excuse, I am recording this at my home office. As you know, I've was on medical leave this week, so this is the best I can do for a recording environment for this. So please excuse any background noises, the birds chirping in the background, dogs, and perhaps kids, and even maybe a wife might interrupt at some point. But all right, so again, this module, this internal analysis module, we had 3 case studies on it in the module. The first was the MBA program at NPS, and we had the reading, creating competitive advantage. And the point there was really emphasis, this idea of comparative advantage, added value, this idea of what it really means to have an advantage. And there's a lot of fluff, as we'll talk about later, around the idea of, everybody says they advantage, but it can't possibly be the case that everyone does. And what does it really mean to have an advantage? The course case study really emphasized the ideas of internal alignment, and we will actually, as it turns out, go into great detail about that today, simply because I've added some slides into the DARPA slides, and subsequently now I've put them into the course slides, that go into greater detail on that concept. But the course case study is not only a excellent case study for teaching this idea of internal alignment, but it also is a excellent case study there for motivating the reading What is Strategy by Michael Porter, which is very important. As I've said, the single reading that I would recommend most to anybody if they really want to know about strategy. In fact, as you'll see, of course, we didn't even cover all of that, all the concepts from that reading in that class, and I've purposely carried some of them over because they overlap with some of the lessons we're going to get today with DARPA, and DARPA is a better teaching vehicle for some of those lessons. And so today we are doing, the DARPA case study, and with the emphasis on the idea of focus and trade-offs. All three of these, comparative advantage, internal alignment, focus and trade-offs, each of these three sort of principles sort of adding on to each other, and each being an element of internal analysis, and generally this idea of what does it mean to have a good strategy. And the two readings we had for today were The Perils of Bad Strategy, or this week, and Can You Say What Your Strategy Is? And we'll talk about each of those readings. Not as deep or complex, certainly as the What is Strategy reading, but very, very helpful in sort of putting a bow on this module. Now, in this module on internal analysis, we've talked about the three questions strategy, the what, where, and how strategy. We'll actually talk about a why today as well. But at its core, the what, where, and how. What is about advantage? What is your advantage? What actually is your comparative advantage that you have relative to alternatives? Scope is where do you have that advantage, right? And scope we're going to talk about a lot later, but the idea is in what's the domain? What are the limits on what is the products, customers, services, channels, methods, whatever, in which you actually have that advantage or want to have that advantage or hope to have that advantage. And activities are about how do you actually seek to achieve and sustain your advantage. What do you actually do to achieve that advantage? The MBA at MPS case study that day, the first case study in the module, was very much focused on advantage, that first question, the what. DARPA today, we're really going to cover thoroughly the idea of scope. And Coors case study was very much about the how, about activities. Now, each of them, of course, overlaps. There's an element of advantage, scope, and activities in our discussion of each one of these three case studies, but each of them sort of focuses on one of the three questions. So today, again, we are here with DARPA and the issue of scope, but also, of course, focus and trade-offs. So let's talk about DARPA. So this is an image of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It's actually from one of their strategic plans, I believe, one of their annual reports to Congress. And I like it because it captures that what DARPA is ultimately is a collection of individuals, right? A collection of researchers, program managers, etc. Most of them, the vast majority of them, not actually DARPA employees, but sort of contract researchers, and we'll talk about that. Now, the reason we're interested in DARPA is arguably, that DARPA is one of the, if not the most successful research organizations in history, in any country, any context, not just defense research. Right? If you think about, since its founding, ideas like the internet, which originally was ARPANET, named after the organization, stealth technology, GPS, night vision, drones. There's a series of technologies that have revolutionized not only combat, but also the way that we live, right? Like I say, think about GPS, internet, etc. And you could certainly argue that the track record of success of DARPA exceeds that certainly of any defense research organization or even any government research organization, but arguably, can you think of another organization that's been around for as long, that has as many successes? You certainly can't put the newbies on the court. You can't put Googles or Facebooks up there. They haven't been around that long. Apple maybe, but Apple certainly has struggled at time and not been around this long, right? IBM, right? But then IBM, of course, for years was arguably a leader, but then for decades, certainly can't match up with DARPA if you look over a 60-year time frame. And so the question is, how does DARPA do it, right? What strategies allow DARPA to be so successful as a research organization? And what makes it a particularly interesting question is that it's part of the DoD bureaucracy. It's part of the Department of Defense. And hate to break it to my defense students, but the DoD does not have a reputation for being, especially innovative, right? When people think about leaders of innovation, right, excluding DARPA, the DoD doesn't come up. whether it's Google or Apple or others at Silicon Valley, or even Dell, or even manufacturing geniuses or innovators. The Department of Defense has had the reputation as being very bureaucratic, right? Very slow, not so nimble. And so what is it about DARPA in that environment that has allowed them to be so successful? And not only are they within that bureaucracy, but they have a limited budget, very few employees, high turnover, no physical research assets. So we really want to understand, if we can understand what it is about DARPA and what's its strategy that's allowed to be so successful despite all these disadvantages or apparent disadvantages, right? We can learn those lessons for innovation in general and for strategy in general. So what is special about DARPA? Right? We want to figure out what makes it distinct relative to other programs, DoD program entities, and relative to other research organizations. Right? We want to compare it to, other, like I say, other DoD programs, research or otherwise, but also, compare it to research that's done in the private sector or other government research entities. Now, ultimately, to understand DARPA, right, we really have to ask the question. It helps to ask the fundamental question, which has really been each of our last 3 concept readings have focused on, which is, what is strategy? Or I put in here parenthetically, I sort of added that, what is good strategy, right, implicitly, right? When we say, what is strategy, we're really talking about what is good strategy. And in the article, What is Strategy? The Perils of Bad Strategy, Can You Say What Your Strategy Is? All 3 of these clearly are focused on that question about what is strategy? What does it mean to have strategy, or implicitly, what does it mean to have a good strategy? Of course, to understand the question of what is a good strategy, it's helpful to first answer the opposite question, which is, what are the bad strategy? And that sort of is explicitly discussed, right, in the reading you had on the Perils of Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt. Now, this article is a short sort of McKinsey Quarterly article, which is kind of an adapted excerpt from his book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, The Difference and Why It Matters. And this is the book I've said to you, if I had to recommend one book to read on strategy, that is the one I probably would recommend. More so than any of Porter's specific books. But this one is, I think, a very, very powerful book. Now, that said, I've actually recently, and I'll reference this, just started a book, and I might as well say it here, one that I would probably now maybe recommend even more than that, is a book called Understanding Michael Porter, The Essential Guide to Competition and Strategy. And this is by Joan Magretta. And I may have to put that, send that or mention that in an email. But this book, I found, because it's, as she says in that book, she talks about Porter. Says, look, Porter's books are books that most managers would like to have read but not actually read. In other words, it's not a fun read. Reading his books on competitive advantage, competitive strategy, they're not fun reads. They're very thick, big books, dense, and dated, right? Whereas what she's done, what Joe Magretta has done, is taken the concepts in those books and all of Porter's subsequent readings, including the reading What is Strategy, and stuff done that insights since that time, right, and put them all together in a very, very good way. It's a 2012 book. Again, Understanding Michael Porter, The Essential Guide to Competition and Strategy by Joan Magretta, Magretta. But I'll share that with you. But I sidetrack myself, get back to the Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. As far as books, that's the type of book, though, by the way, that only strategists would ever read. But a book that's gotten a lot of attention and is written directly by a management guru or strategy guru, I would recommend nothing higher than the Good Strategy, Bad Strategy book by Richard Rumelt. So, what is bad strategy according to Richard Rumelt? Well, he identifies hallmarks of bad strategy, right? And he has 4 of them. The first one is fluff. Right? This idea of, sort of restatement of the obvious with a generous sprinkling of buzzwords, right? Gibberish masquerading as insight and expertise, right? And he gives examples of this in your reading, and this is in the book. But the idea of basically saying nothing, right? Just saying, using a lot of, whether talk about synergy and disintermediation, or throw in some big buzzwords, or customer-centric, or optimization, or whatever you want to say, even some strategy buzzwords, maybe even, focus or things like this. But in the end, or advantage, competitive advantage. But in the end, the question is, what are they really saying? And often these strategy statements are saying very little. Right? If you really cut through the BS, or what he calls Sunday words, big words you would say, I guess, on Sundays, there's really not much there. And they often tend to actually confuse things, right? A good strategy should take a complex role to make it simpler, not make things more complex. If it's confusing, then it's not a good strategy statement, certainly. Certainly not a good statement strategy, and probably not a good strategy, right? If you can't state your strategy in a way that makes sense to someone, like management students like yourselves, then they're not likely to make sense to the frontline employees of an organization. Right? So, and the second sort of hallmark of bad strategy is what he calls failure to face the problem, right? Which is this idea of, he has this insight that we'll get to, which is that strategy is ultimately, and this is sort of actually a good insight that's novel to what he's done here, is that the goal of strategy or the point of strategy has really been lost in some sense. And he says, look, ultimately, you're trying to overcome an obstacle or difficulty, whether or not it's just a matter of profits for a private sector company or something, but there's something that's preventing you from doing that. Over generally, this notion of a bad strategy, he said, came to him, when he was working on national defense strategy, actually. And the idea of ultimately, what is it that you're trying to solve, right? Whether it's, trying to be successful in the private sector, if it's a nonprofit organization trying to, as the Red Cross or Make-A-Wish Foundation or whatever it might be, the ASPCA, what is it that what are you actually trying to do, and what's the challenge that you're trying to solve? If you gave the example of the LA Unified School District, trying to have a strategy for solving, for example, the low graduation rates. Right? Okay, well, what's the challenge that you're actually trying to solve? Right? And ultimately, you've got to define what that challenge is, what makes it difficult. Not just if you're a private sector company, even like Apple or Google or whatever, not just saying, well, profits, we want to have lots of profits or return on investment or whatever it might be. But okay, well, that's fine. But what is it that's really the challenge you've got to solve in this industry, in this context, to be successful? Because ultimately, if you don't define the challenge, how can you evaluate what the strategy is doing well if you haven't defined what the challenge is and how your progress against that challenge? But really sort of just ignoring or failing to acknowledge what the problem is that you're facing. Mistaking goals for strategy, right? This idea that somehow if you just say it, it will happen. It's not build it, they will come. It's not say your goal, this is my goal. And in many times, many strategy statements are in fact goals, just lists of goals, right? If you look at a strategic plan for an organization, it might just be financial statements that project, incomes and revenues and profits for the future and sales. But ultimately, that is not a strategy. You're just sort of stating an objective. Right? And so this idea of, bad strategy is often just a wish list without a plan. Right? And I don't know why it affected me, but this book, The Power of Goals, by Robert M. Sheehan, Jr., PhD. I'm sure he's an excellent researcher, good stuff. I'm sure there's plenty of substance in there, but it just captures it here that somehow you're going to just set a goal and you will succeed. Well, but again, the idea is a goal without a plan is just a wish. Right? That's not a strategy. Right? It's a wish, not a strategy. Right? Strategy is not just about a target. It's about how you can actually reach that target. And the last of the 4 hallmarks of bad strategy is the idea of bad strategic objectives. Right? And he gives Rumelt gives 2 particular examples. One he calls the dog's dinner, which I'm not familiar with the concept of dog's dinner before, and then I realized, okay, what he means is doggy bag, and I think about that. And so what he's talking about is, look, back especially, Rumelt's older than I am, but even especially back before we had microwaves, you weren't going to bring your food home and eat it and reheat it, and so the end of the meal with the family, you just sort of take everything that's left and everybody's, whether it's your pizza, your pasta, your burger, or whatever it might be, your steak, just everything that's left, you scoop it all together, put it in a bag, and that's for the dog. And his idea here is that, look, a lot of times organizations set strategies by simply asking everybody in the room, what do they want? What do they want to achieve? They each have different objectives they want to achieve. And you don't say no to any of them. And you say, you know what, okay, fine. We'll just scoop that all together, all the ideas we've written down. We'll sort of brainstorm things, we'll write them down, and then we'll put all of those into our strategy, into our strategic plan. Right? And so our objectives become this scrambled mess of aspirations, as he says, right? And that's what he calls the dog's dinner set of objectives. Another one is what he calls these blue sky objectives, right? Unrealistic, out of reach goals. Things that, are great, but you'll see a lot of strategic statements about, oh, we're going to be the best in the world at this and world class this and that. Well, you might have 10 companies in the same industry all saying that we're going to be the best in the world at doing something. Well, okay. Maybe that's realistic for a couple of them. A couple of them, maybe aim a little lower, right? And not that you're not never, there's always the idea of stretch goals, but somehow this idea that you've got to set what we'll call later proximate objectives, something that is actually time bound and realistic. And because in the end, remember that a strategy is intended to in the end, strategy is implemented by the end user. Well, I shouldn't even say end user. In military, we talk about strategy as being implemented at the end of the barrel of a gun, right? In other words, it's that you can have a military strategy, but which is to pursue this enemy and not this enemy, and ally with this group and not that group, to combat this and not that, to fight here and not there. But in the end, it's the soldier or sailor who is deciding, for example, whether or not to fire that gun at this particular target. That's going to implement that strategy. And that individual, and in business, it could be the ground level employee or the middle manager who's going to implement the strategy by making decisions on a day-to-day basis. And if the goals are sort of out of reach, it's not going to be anything that's going to motivate them. That's not going to help them. Telling, we want to be the best in the world. Okay, great. Now what do I do? I've got to figure out, what I do with my day as a manager. Well, if having more proximate goals helps. In my example here of the, unrealistic out of reach goals I drew on my childhood, revealing my age a little bit here, but I certainly remember when Evel Knievel, had done all these amazing stunts, and he was going to jump over the Snake River Canyon back in 1974. And I remember having my little Evel Knievel doll, and rubberized doll and the motorcycle that you could rev up, and little Robbie Knievel, his son, that could ride in the back. And he sets his goal, and instead his motorcycle, which really was a rocket of some kind, had problems and basically didn't even make it to the water. Right? Set this far goal and didn't reach it, and that's the danger of these what we call blue sky objectives. So those are the 4 hallmarks of bad strategy: fluff, failure to face the problem, mistaking goals for strategy, and bad strategic objectives. All right. Well, then the question is, why so much? If those are the hallmarks of bad strategy, why do we have so much of it? Right? This shouldn't be that surprising, right? Is anybody at this point, if I had it by show of hands, anybody surprised that these things are out there and that these things don't represent good strategy? I think there's nothing controversial or surprising of what I've said so far, although maybe putting it in a list is helpful. So why is it, right? Well, the answer is, first, this inability to choose. Right? Strategy is about saying no, right? As we'll find out. And ultimately, it's easier to have consensus than conflict, right? Instead of saying no to certain things, just say yes to everything, right? There's this idea of, sort of example, you've got to motivate change, and you've got to have this so-called universal buy-in. You've got to get everybody to buy into change. And, well, no, when it comes to strategy or choosing a strategy, especially by organizations often who don't have a strategy, and then they've, whether certain market realities or budget cuts or whatever make them, suddenly have to have a strategy. If everybody in the organization buys into the strategy, it's probably not a strategy, right? You've got to, frankly, excuse my language, piss off some people. A strategy should piss off some people because it's going to say no to them, to what they think is important, to what they want to do, to what they're good at. Right? But instead, this inability to choose, causes these forms of bad strategy. And another idea is this idea of what we call template-style strategy. And this is this idea that you want a paint-by-numbers approach to strategy, right? And I remember, I've said this before, which is that I've had students who, will, want to do well in my course, but they're not quite getting it. They're very active, they're involved, but they're having trouble getting it, they might say, oh, well, I've certainly spoken often in your course, so I'm sure my participation grade is strong, and it probably is, but in my mind I'm saying, yeah, you spoke a lot, but you also said dumb things, right? And not to be, that's putting too strong of a emphasis on it, right? But the point is that in the end, sometimes people don't get it. It's hard. They want that's why the planning school strategy was so successful, because it told people go do A, B, C, D, E mindlessly, and you'll be doing well. But it's not that simple. But that said, that's what you can sell. and especially consultants, right? They will sell out this, they will go from company to company to company and do visions and missions and values and strategy, and they'll sell it over and over again, right? And that's what consulting is all about. I discovered when I was doing it for a big firm, is about finding a template that's somewhat novel and then selling it again and again and again and again ad nauseum, right? And so you do this template, and the point is first that it's easy, so every client gets it, right? Which is, if you're really doing good strategy, not all clients are going to get it, right? Because it's hard. But all clients get it, and moreover, you don't piss off anybody. Vision and mission and values, those are great. Those are feel-good things, right? Everything's framed positively, no hurt feelings. And if you're a consultant and you want to get repeat business, that's the thing to do. If you go to a bunch of different companies and say, you don't have a strategy, go to another company, well, you have a strategy, but it's a bad strategy. You're not going to, they're going to say, well, you know what, we're going to go to another consultant who tells us what we want to know. They're going to say good things to us. Well, and that's unfortunately the reality of the situation. And so there's this template style of strategy that's come that ultimately emphasizes more about leadership and inspiration and positive things and things that make people feel good, right? When strategy, frankly, like I said, is about saying no. Now, both of those were in your reading on the perils of bad strategy. A third one that's not in the reading, which is interesting. I'm trying to puzzle why they didn't include this in the excerpt that was in the McKinsey article, right? But it's the idea of new thought, right? And my thinking is the reason it wasn't in the McKinsey article is either space considerations, but also I think it might be a little more controversial. Basically, it's a little bit of a cynicism, and if you read the article, the book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, it's a lot of cynicism, but healthy cynicism in some sense, right? Richard Rummel is obviously a grumpy old man in the field of strategy, and strategy needs it, because he's willing to call people out, call out their BS, right? And there's this culture of new thought he talks about, which is the idea that you reach for the impossible. Just sort of, state it and believe it. If you believe it, it will happen, And as long as the organization has some shared vision and mission, that's going to happen, right? If you think it, it will happen. And that's not just in business, but there's this cultural belief, right? The power of positive feelings, the power of positive thinking. And there's no question that psychologically, the psychologist can tell you that, positive thinking helps, right? And it's better to think positively and hopefully than negative, too negatively. On the other hand, look at the successful strategists of the world, people like Andy Grove at Intel, whose book is called Only the Paranoid Survive. Being paranoid is not about having, positive feelings. It's about having negative feelings, right? But in the end, the idea is that there's this belief that if you just put out goals and visions and these sorts of things, that somehow just saying it will happen, right? And his point is that it doesn't work that way, right? Yes, you want people to be motivated and inspired and happy and have positive thoughts, and but in the end, you've got to have an actual coherent guiding policy, and actions to actually get there. All right, so then what is good strategy? And you're reading on the perils of bad strategy. It's interesting. Most of the article is obviously about bad strategy, and at the very end of the article, he actually, as I'm looking at it now myself, I'm really like the second to last page. He finally says, he calls it the kernel of good strategy. What is involved in a good strategy, right? In the kernel, and he calls it a kernel. Here's a kernel, corn kernel, I guess. What's at the core of a good strategy? And he identifies three things. The first thing is diagnosis of the challenge, right? Actually diagnosing the problem that you're facing. The second is guiding policy or overall approach. And the third is coherent actions or coordinated steps. Now, as I mentioned, he sort of mentions this at the end of the article that you guys had. Goes into much more greater detail in the book, and we will go into greater detail today in these slides, about what he means by each of these. What is good strategy? Now, besides that, nice picture of it as a kernel, there, really, what does this mean? And I'm a very visual thinker, and many people are as well. And I had to think about it visually. And so this is a diagram a drawing, illustration I created to help you figure out what he's saying about these three things: about the diagnosis of the challenge, the guiding policy or overall approach, and the set of coherent actions. And so think about the idea that you're a, hiker, outdoor explorer. Where you are now is here on the left. Where you want to be is on the right. But the first thing is, in between where you are and where you want to be is an obstacle, right? Or a couple obstacles in this case, right? That is the challenge that you have to diagnose and overcome. That is what's standing between where you want to be and where you are, right? In this case, this explorer, this adventurer, has a mountain, and a big body of water, a big lake in between him where he is now and where he wants to be, right? And he knows that he's got to that's the challenge he's got to diagnose and overcome, is how he's going to get past either the mountain or the body of water to get to where he wants to be. And so therefore, and the next element is, of course, that he could either sort of climb the mountain or cross the lake, right? To sort of get there. And that decision, that's the guiding policy or overall approach, right? That's the second element of the strategy of the kernel of a good strategy, is the overall approach. What's the general approach, right? Is he going to climb the mountain, or is he going to cross the lake? And suppose he decides to actually climb the mountain, right? Then the third element is the coherent actions or coordinated steps. In other words, what are the actual, so once you've decided to climb the mountain, now, okay, what are the actions or steps you're going to take to actually do that? Right? And those are the three elements, according to Richard Rumelt, that of three key elements of strategy, or in his description, the kernel of a good strategy consists of diagnosing the challenge, determining a guiding policy or overall approach, and identifying coherent actions or coordinated steps to get there. Now, you also had a sort of companion reading, if you will, this week, or with the DARPA case study, which is called "Can You Say What Your Strategy Is?" by David Collis and Mike Ruckstad. I asked you to read this as well because I think it highlights some important things about what a strategy should be. I mean, the Porter reading and the Porter readings are very sort of high level about strategy, as opposed to, okay, if you want a strategy statement, what actually should be in there? And this sort of tells you that. But it also tells you that most people don't actually have a strategy statement, right? I've included this reading, because of that, because of the content it contains. I think it's very helpful. I also, though, have to confess to having a little bit of bias. Both David Collis and Mike Ruckstad were colleagues of mine. Mike Ruckstad, in particular, we worked together a lot. We worked together on actually the Daimler-Chrysler merger when Daimler-Benz, of course, acquired Chrysler. We worked on the post-merger integration. We went over to Stuttgart, Germany, and ate blood sausage, etc. Spent weeks there working with them. And so his ideas are ideas with which I'm strongly familiar, for having worked with him very closely. And moreover, he died very young. He had a heart attack at an age younger than I am now. Well, he was older than me then, but younger than I am now. And so I certainly have some emotional connection. And this article actually came out posthumously. This article came out after he had already left us. But I'm not just including it for my sentimental reasons. It gives you some insights that we'll talk about that are very valuable here. Let me quote it, though, the central premise here of why this article was written. So, quote, "Leaders fail to appreciate the necessity of having a simple, clear, succinct strategy statement that everyone can internalize and use as a guiding light for making difficult choices. A well-understood statement of strategy aligns behavior within the business. It allows everyone in the organization to make individual choices that reinforce one another." And so what is that? So this is the idea of the importance of a strategy statement. And as they say, the dirty little secret is that most organizations don't or cannot say within, say, 30 words or less what the strategy is. And if they do, they don't include the elements they should. And so what are those elements? Well, they highlight three. The first is the objective, right? The second is the scope, and the third is advantage. By objective, we're talking about the ends that you hope to achieve, right? And the idea of something that's specific, measurable, and time-bound, right? That's proximate and achievable, right? So not some vague notion of being the best at something, but something specific. If you want to evaluate your strategy, you've got to and know whether you're achieving it or not. You've got to have specific measures that you're looking to use to evaluate your performance. And it's got to be within a certain time. It's you can say sort of achieve leadership by this date, etc. Because otherwise, you can always say, well, we've moved closer, But it's also got to be proximate and achievable, something that is realistic, that is within the time horizon of, if it's something that an employee says, this organization might achieve it, but not while I'm here, right? Or I might be long gone, or certainly not. It's, whether or not I do this today isn't going to affect whether we achieve this 10 years from now. But something that is more short-term, or something that is near enough that it actually motivates behavior today, right? But also achievable, right? Not out of reach, something realistic. If the objective is out of reach, then why should I bother as an employee trying to achieve it? Because no matter how hard I work, we're not going to get that. Scope is a domain, sort of the idea of where. Again, it's the where strategy. Where you're going to actually, what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, where you're going to compete or where you're going to operate. And advantage is the means to that ends, they call it. Now, they sort of blend two things with their definition of advantage here, and I think it's probably maybe not a healthy blending, but they talk about this first thing about the value proposition, which is really this external. It's about it's really about the competitive advantage. We've described it before. What is your value proposition? What is your added value that you bring? But also internal, they talk about the activity system. So they actually blend the advantage in their notion of what they call advantage. They actually blend what we've been calling advantage and activities. They actually blend the what and how, if you will, that we've been talking about so far. But those are the three things that they say are the key elements of strategy statement. So putting those two together, these two readings, the reading The Perils of Bad Strategy by Rummelt presents what he calls the kernel of good strategy. The reading Can You Say What Your Strategy Is by Collis and Ruckstad presents what they call the elements of a strategy statement. And to each of them answer the why, where, what, and how questions of strategy. And the kernel of good strategy has the following three elements: a diagnosis of the challenge, which is the why question. Why are we doing what we're doing, or what is it we're hoping to achieve? Right? What's the point here? Then this idea of the guiding policy, it's really what we've been calling strategic position. Right? Really, it's about scope and advantage, but the guiding policy is sort of the where and the what questions combined. And then ultimately, talk about a set of coherent actions, the third element of the kernel of good strategy, and that's really the how. The elements of a strategy statement, they also has three elements, but they sort of overlap differently, right? You sort of see here, they talk about the why, and they talk about as an objective. What is the objective? The where question, of course, is scope. Okay? And then the what and how, they blend together. They call it advantage. And the first part, the what, is the value proposition, that they describe, and the advantage being, of course, the activity system. So we're going to go through the why, where, what, and how, and applying together both of these two readings and integrating it as appropriate with what we've had from last time with the Porter reading on what is strategy. So let's first focus about the why, and let's talk about the diagnosis, right? And what Rummelt talks about in terms of diagnosis. And again, your reading in The Perils of Bad Strategy doesn't go deeply into it, but in the book he does. And so this is really this idea of identifying, describing, diagnosing the challenge that you're facing as an organization. Now, the diagnosis, ultimately the idea is to sort of look at and identify describe the basic nature of the problem. Right? What are the most critical aspects that you've got to solve? Right? And to simplify it, right? If you just say the challenge is to be successful in this or in this industry, ultimately, a goal is, like I say, we're going to talk about the why being the objective, but really the idea of what is the challenge, right? And it's got to be something that, what is it? What is the problem? What's preventing you from that? What would make it difficult for you to achieve what you want to achieve, right? And the idea might be, I gave the example of the LA Unified School District, trying to work on, if they're trying to reduce, or increase graduation rates, what's really the problem here, right? Is the reason that people aren't graduating because, they're not motivated? Probably not. Is it because, there's a lot of things that are, could be going into it. It could be, the performance of the schools and the quality of the teaching. It could be a whole bunch of things, but really identifying what is the challenge, what's causing. If you're trying to reduce, and we'll get to the idea of objective in a minute, if that's what you're ultimately trying to do, so to reduce, delinquency or increase graduation rates, what ultimately is the challenge that you've got to overcome to do that? Now, some of those challenges, by the way, might be things that you really aren't actionable, right? For the LA Unified School District, certain demographic realities, whether it be, people leaving school because of they need to work to support their family. These are things that the LA Unified School District, for example, in their strategy are not likely to be able to have. They're not going to be actionable for them. So you've got to ultimately sort of not only explain it, but have actionable implications, because this is going to define, as I say, sort of, what it is you're targeting. Right? So again, diagnose the challenge of the problem. Now, this is our first sort of discussion we had on Tuesday, and we certainly would have had on Wednesday and Thursday about DARPA. Understanding what is DARPA's challenge, right? And frankly, to some degree, this is why we do the DARPA case. This is why the DARPA case came to, was initially something of interest to myself, to Nick Dew, and others, right? Because frankly, DARPA does do good job of diagnosing the challenge, and it's not a private sector, profitability market share type thing. And so we had this discussion, on Tuesday, and I've had it before. And so I've now created and posted with the slides sort of some summaries of understanding these ideas, either sort of responses we got in class on Tuesday, but also previously, or just generally, about this idea of what the challenge is. And I'm not going to read this all to you. This would be my eyes are just getting spinning looking at it. But the idea is that you want to think about what the challenge is and why it's so difficult, right? And just to highlight some things, think about the idea of matching military problems, with the technological opportunities, right? The idea of connecting needs and seeds, right? That can be very difficult because sometimes knowing what, the idea is there's no easy match between the two. The needs and seeds don't talk much. The scientists who might not even be thinking about defense application aren't talking to the military folks who need that solution, right? And so they might not even know they're trying to invent something. They have no idea what the use is going to be, right? The military knows they have a problem, but they don't know what the solution is, right? And connecting those two is certainly a challenge. Ultimately, their mission is to prevent technological surprise, right? That is what they're supposed to do. Well, but of course, surprise by definition is unpredictable, right? So that's kind of difficult, right? And there's a tendency to want to, pull away from the horizon, the future surprise, and solve the problems we know, right? The idea of think about the guy who lost his keys in the parking lot, and he's looking for his keys under the street light, and his friend says, "Why are you looking under the street light?" Right? Because why do you think that your keys would be there? Well, because that's the only place he can see. There's no point in looking for his keys in the dark of the rest of the parking lot because you can't see them. Right? There's a tendency to want to go to where you can easily find the solution, right? When really the solution might be out there in the dark, where you can only get a faint image. Quote about, of course, creating future military capabilities is difficult because you don't really know what's going to be valuable in the future, right? And there's this pressure to solve the known problems. And generally this idea of getting the Department of Defense to focus on advanced research, right? With great potential benefit in the future, but with high potential benefit, high reward, there's high risk, high failure risk. Again, that is a challenge. And then again, why it's so difficult, and getting the DoD to invest in things that many of which might be complete duds. Other ideas, creating tolerance for failure, within a community where the mindset of the failure is not an option. There's limited budgets in the public sector. I really don't want to waste the money, right? But so, tolerance for failure is not, something that certainly in my experience is common in the military culture. Attract quality researchers, of course, but the idea is, academic research often don't really care about the practical application, right? Plus, if it's top secret, I can't get any credit for it. If you require high security, there's no non-citizens or people who, not to stereotype academics, obviously I'm a military academic, so I don't fall in this category, but, they might think, wait, do I have to pass a drug test? These sorts of things, right, might be difficult, because of the context. Create cooperation. This is sort of a subtle but important thing, which is, if I'm a business, researcher, then I want to protect my intellectual property. I want to profit from it. If I'm an academic, I want to get credit for it. I just got finished watching the movie and the band played on about the discovery of the gene that caused the HIV/AIDS and how the delay of getting tests for HIV/AIDS because academic researchers are arguing over who's going to get the credit for it, right? And then ultimately this idea of generally overcoming the DoD bureaucracy. Right? So these are the challenges and then sort of the difficulties of it. Right? And that's really about, and in fact, like I said, is that in the book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, Richard Rummel actually points to DARPA and points to their strategy statement and saying, look, in the strategy statement right up front, this is an exhibit, this was one of the exhibits in the case study, that's from DARPA's strategic plan, right up front. They are identifying exactly what the challenge is that they're facing. So here's, a quote from that. So, but I don't know, I sort of highlighted these words that are small there, but bigger. The basic challenge and focus of DARPA. A basic challenge is matching military problems with technological opportunities. Parts of this challenge are extremely difficult because 1, some military problems have no easy or obvious technical solutions, and 2, emerging technologies may have far-reaching military consequences that are still unclear. DARPA focuses investments on this quote-unquote DARPA hard niche, a set of technical challenges that, if solved, will be of enormous benefit to U.S. national security, even if the risk of technical failure is high. Right? So, as Rummel points out, here's DARPA. They don't have, they can't think about themselves in terms of profit or return on investment, the same sorts of things that private sector companies do. But certainly this idea of they've identified right up front, what is the challenge we're trying to solve? What is the problem we exist to fix? Right? And Rummelt, pushes DARPA out there as an example of an organization that's got that first part of the kernel of good strategy. In other words, diagnosis, got it right. Right? So that's the idea of the how, certainly in the kernel of good strategy, the why question. The why question in the elements of a strategy statement is more specific. This idea of the objective. What is the specific, measurable, time-bound, proximate, achievable objective that we're going to have, that we're going to measure, right, to evaluate performance, right? And this, if you apply this, for example, to the DARPA question, it certainly is more difficult. Right? And I asked this idea, so we'll also discuss that, how do we measure DARPA's performance? How do we know they're doing well or not doing well in overcoming that challenge we just described? Right? And so, again, here are notes from Tuesday class, but also from other discussions. This idea of, in Tuesday, we really focused on three things. We talked about, I put out there the measure that actually is used by, for example, I remember when I was talking to the ACTD folks. I used to work with the ACTD folks. This is before it became the JCTD, the Joint Concept Technology Demonstration. It was the Advanced Concept Technology Demonstration. And their measure of performance was the percent of projects that they transitioned to the field, right? That some COCOM sort of took over and invested in. And they had numbers above 90%. And I said to them, and they said, well, we want to get it even higher. And I said, well, actually, I would think you'd want to get it even lower, right? Now, maybe that's not their niche, but they're at the time called the Advanced Concept Technology Demonstration. If you really are doing advanced concepts, these are concepts, right? Not products, not individual technology, but concepts that are advanced. And you're trying to stay ahead of the enemy, or be not just the best military out there, but non-state actors and terrorist groups, etc. You want to stay ahead of all of them. You've got to take some risks, and if you are measuring yourself by how many things you invest in actually end up being productive products, if you will, right? Then that means that you're not investing. If you're trying to get that, if that's how you measure success, that's going to discourage risk taking, right? And that's a danger, right? Because you want to, if your role is to be advanced, then you've got to take some of those risks. In general, other quantifiable measures we talked about in class, the idea that it's very hard to quantify the true performance, right? How do you evaluate, how do you measure the degree of deterrence or lives saved or greater accuracy of a weapon? How do you measure those things, right? And also this idea of how much credit do we, so DARPA helped pioneer the internet and GPS and these sorts of things, but, they ultimately handed these things off to others who then, pushed them till they were actually practical applications. So how much credit do we actually give to DARPA, right? So even if we could quantify it, how would we quantify the share of the benefit of the added value that we would attribute to DARPA? Right? So then there's this idea of more subjective performance measures, and there's certainly that's probably where it's better to measure DARPA. But then you got to understand there could be potential biases, right? If organizations maybe compete with DARPA, right? If there's so they might have negative views. I mean, I've sort of mentioned that there were times I've met with military organizations that I won't necessarily name, but who sort of wanted to be like DARPA. Probably shouldn't have been, because DARPA had their distinct positioning. Right? So they might evaluate them. They might think that, hey, we can do better. Right? Or there might be a researcher who didn't get a DARPA project funded and is upset about it. But also this halo effect, right? Look, you might think DARPA can do no wrong because of their past successes. So the bias could go the other way. Another thing is what about current DARPA work? So the past work may give them good reputation, but the idea is their current work, frankly, it might be secret. It might not have any application for a long time out. So it might be great work, but we wouldn't know. Or it might be bad work, but we wouldn't even know, right? And so it's very hard, even in subjective measures, because of a lack of visibility. So you get this idea that although DARPA has done a good job of describing the why in terms of the challenge it faces, how would you measure it is certainly a challenge for an organization like this. Right? So which brings us to the where, or the next question, which is the where and the what. And Rummelt sort of groups the two into what he calls the guiding policy. Right? The guiding policy. What does he mean by guiding policy? So here's what he says. He says the guiding policy, of course, is the overall approach. In our example or diagram here, it's the idea of the explorer choosing to climb the mountain as opposed to crossing the lake, right? But Rummelt talks about it this way. It's again the overall approach. But I think the best analogy he gives, and so I've got some pictures here that give the analogy, right? So the idea of a lighthouse, sort of basically guiding you in basically the right direction, right? Or a compass, which helps guide your direction. But the best example he gives, he talks about the guardrails on a highway. Right? The guardrails, they don't prevent you. So if you think about the guardrails on a highway, the idea is they don't prevent you. You can go a little bit, especially if it's multiple lanes, you can go to the left, the right, you can go different ways to get where you're trying to go. But basically, it keeps you contained. It tells you where you don't go. It prevents you from going off course, and in the picture here, going off down the cliff into the lake or something like that. And so that's the idea of the guardrails, right? Sort of is the idea of ruling out certain things, right, that you don't do. But there's a quote actually from that Magretta book on Porter that I talked about, which is this idea, and I may put it in the slides for the dynamic analysis module. But the strategy is a path, not a point, right? And so the idea is that it's guides you. It's not standing still, right? But it's guiding you in a certain direction. But it's letting you a little flexibility here. That's the idea of the overall, approach or the guiding policy. And in some sense, it's equivalent to what we've been calling strategic position, right? It's equivalent to, what is your basic advantage that you have, and what is your scope within which you operate or have that advantage, right? And so the guiding policy, in the way that Rummelt talks about, is really, a combination of scope and advantage. Right? And so let's talk about the first part of that then, which is first part of the guiding policy, which is scope, and which is specifically the second element of the strategy statement. Now, as we this actually ties back to, remember, this is from last time with the Coors case study, right? With the Coors case study, remember, we covered these first few bullets. We talked about the strategies, the balance of advantages, strategy versus operational effectiveness, strategy resting on unique activities, activity fit and internal alignment. And I said the last three bullets we're going to talk about them in the DARPA case. And so we've gotten to, we're going to talk about those three today. Right, and so there's some overlap between the new stuff and the old stuff, if you will, from last week. So we've got now this first element of overlap, which is the idea of scope choice. So remember, again, we're talking about this is the where question strategy, the scope. Right, this is the where question strategy, and we can break that question down even more thoroughly. So where or in what space or environment does your organization seek to achieve its advantage? Now Porter talks about the where question in a section of the reading on what is strategy. The reading is called, the section, I believe, and I'm looking at it right now, is called The Origin of Strategic Positions. It's on page 6, what's labeled number 65, but it's under the title, we talk about unique activities, we talk about the origin of strategic positions. Right? And I don't think he actually uses the word scope in there, which is a shame because it's, the reality is it is a discussion of scope, but, and so that would tie it to general notion of scope. But he's talking about the idea of certain positioning. He's talking about a variety-based positioning, a needs-based positioning, and the access-based positioning. In other words, remember, he's talking about the origins of strategic position. What is the origin of strategic position? So at its core, he's saying, is a scope choice. A variety-based position is one in which at its core, organization is making choices about what product or services it provides. An organization with a needs-based positioning is at its core making decisions about particularly what set of customers it serves. And an access-based positioning is one that's making decisions and limiting what locations and what channels the organization serve its customers. So let me show that visually, and this is actually a slide that you've seen before, but it will help me emphasize each of those. So think about this idea of a product or service, a variety-based position is one in which you are consciously choosing to limit your product or service scope. And so here, again, the example, I used a convenient clip art of fruits and vegetables. Well, actually, I guess it's all fruits here, right? And in order you might choose to, sell apples and bananas and pears, but not oranges or strawberries, right? That is a product scope choice. It could also be, if you're not doing product or service, it could be service scope choice. What product or services will you offer and what you don't? A variety-based positioning, therefore, is one in which at its core, what's driving it is choices about which products you will offer, product services you offer, and which you won't. It's actually, although what's a little confusing about it, it's a variety-based positioning, but that means at its core, it's a positioning based on offering a limited variety, a very specific variety. You're not open to all potential varieties. You're at your core choosing, this is where we're going to be, achieve our objectives, be successful, have an advantage, is with these products and not these other products. At the other end, another common way we define scope is based on customers or users. And what that means is when you might choose to serve certain customers but not others, or better yet, you might choose to target certain customers but not others. It doesn't mean that you don't you necessarily turn those customers away, right? It's just that you're not necessarily designing your offering. I'll talk later about McDonald's. If you are someone who likes whole natural foods grown locally, vegetarian, McDonald's will serve you, but they're probably not going to have much on the menu that you're going to want, right? They're not turning you away, but they're not going to design their offerings for that customer, right? To use an example of the executive MBA, right? This is a defense-focused EMBA. We are designed for people who are employed by defense organizations, whether they be active duty military or civilians, DoD personnel, right? But lo and behold, we have FBI students who who in our program. We have NASA students as well who aren't necessarily defense; they're federal government, and and the issue is not that we turn them away, although there certainly are some we do, right? You cannot be any private, somebody who's employed by Procter & Gamble can't just suddenly come to the NPS MBA program. But even if there may be some students who we do allow in the program, but the issue is, do we customize, right? Do we actually specifically design, our offering to meet their needs? Or is it that here's what we offer, if you like it, great. Right? That's the idea of a needs-based positioning. Now again, the word could be confusing because it's not about sort of satisfying some universal need, but the specific, but satisfying all the needs of a particular customer group. And then the idea is that if you've got these products, these customers, right, how do you get them from one to the other? How do you get the product? That's the idea of channels or locations, and that's what protocol is, the access-based positioning. How do you access? How do customers access you, or you access customers, or these sorts of things, right? And the idea would be, here in this example, you might choose, I'm willing to do over-the-counter sales and phone sales, but I'm not going to do online sales or direct mail sales or door-to-door sales. That would be choosing certain channels over others, right? So think about, I like to use the example of Amazon.com, at least when it first came out, right? And they only offered books, right? Now, they were offering the same product or services as Barnes & Noble with their brick and mortar stores, and arguably targeting roughly the same customers, a little different, obviously, who would buy online versus buy in a store, right? But the real basis of Amazon's positioning is deciding to do it online instead of brick and mortar, right? And that is an access-based positioning, right? They also give the example of Carmike Cinemas in the reading and others who choose to focus on the rural consumer, right? The rural customer as opposed to the urban, or more stay in the suburbs as opposed to downtown, right? And Walmart to some degree historically had sort of that basis of positioning. It was geographically based. Edward Jones, which will come up, also more rural or suburban than say Merrill Lynch or other brokerage. And so again, based on the geography or the channel, you could have a access-based positioning. But each of these, notice that a variety-based positioning is about choosing a specific, limited variety of product or services. A access-based positioning is about serving a specific, limited ways in which a customer might access you, or you might access the customer. A needs-based positioning is about serving the needs of a limited customer base. Each of these are where you, at your core, are choosing to limit yourself. Now, organizations might have multiple. They might have a combination of variety and needs-based positioning. And these aren't mutually exclusive, but in the end, certainly some predominate, right? Amazon.com, for example, naturally, there's certain customers who are more likely to go to Amazon.com as opposed to Barnes & Noble to buy their books back in, say, 1998, right? But that wasn't, the conscious choice wasn't to necessarily target those consumers. It was to target a particular channel, and the particular consumers who to whom that appealed was a natural outgrowth. Right? So let me give an example. For example, Coors. Right? We think about Coors, right? As far as here's their scope, their product or service scope, right? They had only Coors Banquet beer, one beer, right? Back in '77, right? No popular beer, no super premium beer, no light beer. They had one beer brand, one product, right? And so that is a clear decision to have a limited variety that they offer. They offer, location-wise, single brewery in Colorado, no distribution east of Mississippi, West only, right? So, again, choosing to consciously serve a limited set of locations. And as far as needs-based, their target customers, I imagine there might be a different type of customer who would buy Coors Banquet than would buy, Bud Light or Schlitz or, a high-end super premium beer in 1977. But in the end, that wasn't necessarily a choice. They didn't choose to target those consumers. That was just sort of the result. Anybody would drink that, there weren't. So certainly, if we were trying to identify, and I asked you this in the quiz on Coors, does Coors have more of a variety-based position, access-based, or needs-based, right? You could argue that they're clearly choosing to have a limited variety and a limited geography. Right? So that would be I would buy an argument for that. But a needs-based positioning, really, I do not see a good argument for that being at the core or the origin of their position, to use Porter's language. We've also used the example of Dell and talked about Dell's scope as being motivating a lot of this, a lot of their advantage. So we go back to Dell, and Dell's certainly their advantage has slipped in the last decade or even two, right? But certainly, let's go back to the 1990s when they took the PC industry by storm, right? And this sort of shows their performance relative to the other top four. These are the top 5 PC makers in the late 1990s or mid to late 1990s, right? We see how Dell so much outperformed IBM, Compaq, HP, and Gateway, so much so that IBM, Compaq, and Gateway quickly left the business. Right? And much of the story of Dell's success is one of scope choice, right? If you look at the PC, here's Dell's sort of. If you look at PC sales by channel in 1998, right, this is one way to look at scope. So this is access-based positioning. So the access that they're each choosing, how each of these top 5 PC makers in 1998 are choosing to position themselves in terms of their access. Right? Now notice throughout the U.S., 30% was direct sales in 98, 41% distributor reseller, and 22% retail, and 7% other. But you'll see that these are not far apart, right? I mean, there's a big percentage, 22% retail. The biggest one is 41%. It's not like one dominant, even majority channel. But that said, notice that every one of the PC makers chose a specific focus. Each of them, even though the biggest percentage here we have in the first column is 41%, they each chose to put at least 2/3, right, of their business in one channel. Right? Dell and Gateway, very, very much focused on direct sales. It's only 30% of the market, but they have 87%, 90% of their sales that way. IBM, Compaq, and HP, very much focused on the distributor reseller market, right, or channel. Even though they have 70%, 67%, 75%, even though overall it's only 41% of the overall market. And they've also each chosen to not focus in certain areas, right? With the trade-off, where do they really have very little presence? Of course, this other, we can sort of cross that out. But if you look at, Dell's presence, almost no presence in distributor reseller and literally no presence in retail in 98, whereas IBM, Compaq, HP have essentially no direct sales presence in 98. And Gateway has none. Gateway is very much similar position to Dell in this regard. And this tells much the story of the struggles of IBM, Compaq, and HP during this time period, right? Because Dell had discovered that as the industry evolved, people were more willing to buy direct. They didn't need the hand-holding of the retailers, the resellers. They, big companies had their own IT networks, so didn't need the help from the value-added resellers who might install and maintain networks, things like that. People were willing to buy direct, and businesses were willing to buy direct in particular. Right? 98, keep in mind, this is AOL time. This is very early on. People, individual consumers, weren't necessarily all buying PCs at the time, but big businesses, especially were willing to buy direct. Larger businesses. And so you might look at this and say, well, and it's not surprising that IBM, Compaq, and HP struggled because they were in a channel that was, shrinking, whereas Dell positioned itself in a channel or access-based positioning, which was growing, right? And Gateway, you might say, oh, well, Gateway seemed to have gotten it. So what happened to Gateway? Because they should have been, they sort of duplicated Dell in that regard. So shouldn't Gateway have had duplicated Dell's success? Well, again, we can look at scope in multiple dimensions. This is only one of them in terms of access or channels. What about if we looked at them in terms of needs-based positioning? In other words, the customer scope, the buyer scope, right? Well, so here's the PC sales by buyer segments in 98. Now there really were overall, there were we could break it into five sort of segments: home and small office, small and medium business, large business, government, education. Now government education were pretty small, but the first three were the majority of the market. Home and small office, home buyers or small, people, individual home business or something, a small office, small and medium business or large business. Well, now if you look at these percentages, now we don't have, and then again, it can be dizzying, so let me help break this down for you. Let's first look at where do they each choosing to focus now in terms of their buyer segments, right? Where do they have at least 30% of their sales? Well, Dell they chose to be very dominant in terms of small and medium business, large business, right? We look at IBM Compact and HP, right? They were in here. They tend to have their smallest. They not as much in the large businesses, but the small medium businesses in the home and small office, right? Gateway, very very focused on the home and small office, 58%. The biggest number you'll see on the screen, right, is the 58%. Meanwhile, where are they each having a trade-off? They have less than 20% of their sales, right? Government education are small, so everybody's got little in there, but Dell has very few of its sales in the home and small office. IBM Compact and HP don't have any numbers other than the bottom here that are less than 20%. But Gateway has not much presence in the small and medium business and almost none in the large business. In these top 3 rows, the smallest number is definitely that 9% number under Gateway. And now you sort of see, look, that Gateway had the exact opposite positioning of Dell when it comes to the needs. They had identical positioning when it came to the access or channel, and the opposite positioning when it came to the needs of the buyer segment, right? And this helps explain why Gateway struggled, because you think about it. They're choosing to sell direct. Who's going to buy direct back in 1998? Well, it wasn't going to be necessarily the home and small office, the people who weren't that familiar, maybe didn't know what they wanted, would want to go to a retail store and ask the salesman, or if it's a small business, they don't have their own IT department, so they therefore yes, they know what they want, but then they want a value-added reseller to sort of install it and maintain the network. Whereas the people who are really going to buy direct are the big businesses, the people who have their own IT department, they don't need the resellers, they know what they want, right? And so Gateway had a channel positioning that was completely inconsistent with its customer positioning, right? And that's why Gateway, for example, had to do the Gateway stores, where their customers could go and actually try out the computers, and the big stores that looked like they were painted like a cow, right? And you could sort of see the idea, so that the home and small office and the others who wanted to buy from Gateway could actually have the hand holding they needed. But then even in a Gateway store, you then had to go and order, they had to ship it to you direct. And so it was just an incompatibility between these two things. And so, but the point is that with these 2 slides, I can explain to you much of the reason that Dell was successful, whereas IBM Compact and Gateway, IBM Compact and HP all struggled, but IBM Compact and HP and Gateway all left the business, weren't even in the business 10 years later. All right, and so that's another scope example. Third example would be Edward Jones. Right? Edward Jones is highlighted in your reading. It is a full-service broker, and it is one of the highest performing by measures of return on equity, other measures of the full-service brokers that are out there, better than Merrill Lynch, A.G. Edwards, Payne Weber, etc. So Edward Jones has done remarkably well in the brokerage business, but they've done remarkably well by being remarkably different. If you think about Edward Jones' scope, right? If we divide it in terms of their customers, their needs, access, variety, right? It's unusual, right? Their customers, individual investors only, right? No investment funds, no institutional investors. Their location and channels. They like to have rural, suburban offices, face-to-face interaction. They don't even like to discuss over the phone. They want you to come in and talk to them and meet with them, and they don't do it online. They don't do it over the phone. They like to have the face-to-face interaction with their clients. What are the products and services? Conservative investments only, right? They don't own any of their own funds. All the others do. The Merrill Lynch, the A.G. Edwards, the Schwab, they all own their own funds, not Edward Jones. No online trading, right? They're, as it says here, the last .com broker. Imagine that. Imagine having a broker that doesn't do online trading, right? And it does get this image of the American Gothic and this, small town sort of thing, and very limited investment banking. So they've chosen to do things that seem like dated, seem like decades in the past, very limited, not embracing all these new sorts of hot things in the industry, and yet they've done better than all those who have embraced those things. And so Edward Jones is having very clear, conscious scope choices and limiting their scope and able to be very successful in doing so. Third example, we talked about, of course, the Graduate School of Business and Public Policy at NPS and its scope choices in terms and the idea of, again, we think about its positioning. We emphasize comparative advantage, but if you think about this, right, let's think about what we sort of offer, right? And I think, I mean, if I, clearly the scope choice that MPS makes, the business school makes, is much more driven by, I think a needs-based positioning. Customers or users, right? Choosing to have the students are only uniformed military personnel, DoD civilians, allied nation defense personnel, right? The employers, military services, etc. That's our customer focus. That's the customer we serve. The products, well, it's of course therefore defense-focused management content. Offer master's degrees, no bachelor or doctorate, although we've talked about trying to get a doctoral program at MPS. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon in the business school. Obviously, other schools at MPS have doctorates. We historically, when I first started teaching, we had no short executive education programs at all when I first wrote this case study, when I first came to MPS. Now, of course, we have more of these, there are executive education offered by NPS, but not, there was always executive education offered by NPS, but it was by a different entity, the Center for Executive Education, it's called at NPS. But we've started doing a little bit of our own, right? And doing these short courses, certificate courses, the Army Cost Management program. It's Army Cost Management certificate course, right? And so we sort of not necessarily stuck to this limited variety or product or services. Also, channels or locations, resident. It used to be just resident, right? But then we had VTC, the EMBA. But we tended to say no asynchronous internet delivery. Well, we've historically, but now we've expanded that. We used to have no satellite campuses, but of course we have now the NPS, National Capital Region, and there's talk about doing work with Virginia Tech, etc. So I would say that if we had to think about what the basis of the origin of MPS's sort of positioning is, it is about serving a particular set of serving the needs of a particular set of customers. Right? It's much more needs-based positioning. Right? We do have some limited scope choices when it comes to access or variety, but that's more dictated by what the customer wants. Right? In many cases, if the customer said, for better or for worse, when the customer says, "Hey, we want you to offer this short program," or "We want you to offer asynchronous delivery," we've been willing to expand our scope in that area. And so certainly, to the degree that we have a specific scope choice, it's much more driven by the needs-based positioning. So again, so let me discuss this with DARPA. But one of the things with DARPA is because DARPA is a research organization. If you think about research organization, these labels, variety, access, needs, we may not think about product or services or customers or users, but if you think about, for example, the needs-based position, what does it mean in a research organization? What we're really saying is, what are the applications, right? Broadly the customers, but we're doing research that we hope will be applied in what areas, right? At the other extreme, if we say products or services, right? The idea is ultimately we're developing technology. So what are the type of technologies? That's a variety of technologies. What are the type of technologies that DARPA is going to do or not do? And then the idea of channels or locations. Channels. Okay, wait a minute. Think about channels. Well, getting a technology to an application, right? So just basically, what's the research approach? How can we sort of define the type? If we wanted to define DARPA scope, we would do it, by talking about the technologies, the research approach, and the applications. What they do and they don't do. Right? As I'll say in a second, though, understand that Porter gives these three origins. They aren't absolute. They aren't the only ones. They're not mutually exclusive, right? But they help you understand key scope choices. And we'll define DARPA scope in multiple ways. But this is one way to sort of do it. The closest parallel we can get to Porter's variety, access, and needs is to talk about technologies, approach, and applications. Right? And so when we discussed this on Tuesday, and previously when we discussed this case study, we sort of have these ideas. And again, I don't want to say read it to you, but you can sort of certainly see that there's certainly, I think, applications, working this way. What are the applications that DARPA focuses on? Well, it used to be ARPA, but it became DARPA. It is focused on primarily military needs and problems. There are some non-military uses, right? Sort of hybrid applications, and that's sort of a good thing because it can attract some business interest if you have applications that have potentially a market, a commercial application. Right? We solve only DARPA hard problems. Remember what they said DARPA hard was. Something that high technical risk, no easier known solution, but if you can solve it, it's a potential game changer, right? So those are the applications. Future capabilities, not known technologies, not current needs, right? So those are sort of the applications, or the problems that we try to solve. What technologies are they willing to invest in to solve them? Well, again, radical, advanced, high risk, high reward, more basic research, and things that the services are unlikely to pursue, right? And so that's sort of the idea of the advanced technology for military applications. So you can sort of see where this DARPA scope in those terms. What about the research approach? Well, they talk about working right to left from the need to a tech solution. In other words, the idea of saying instead of just having a technology and developing it and then seeing where it takes you, but no, think about the military need and work backward to say what type of technology might actually solve that. The big things here: outsourcing all research. Right? They outsource all research. They don't do any of their research in house. They do both competition and cooperation in the research team. They have these challenges, but they have multiple research teams that can be competing, but also they want cooperation. And they still literally this idea of toleration of risk and failure and sort of freedom for the researcher. So you could, again, these are things that have come up in the discussion, but ways you can define DARPA scope choices. But you can also define them by some of the things that were right there in the case study itself, right? We talked about the different technology readiness levels, right? And they're defined in many different ways. These first 4 lines of this was one of the exhibits in the case. There's so many labels in the military for each different TRL or technology readiness level. It's hard to say, but it certainly goes from much more basic, research to more from basic to applied to sort of system development and application sort of thing like that. But and I mapped out, and there were multiple. Different sources actually will give you would map them out differently. So this is sort of my amalgamation of what I found from my work. But you sort of see that DARPA has this positioning where they're really going to focus on things that are the less ready, if it's technology ready. Sort of more basic research, more applied research, but less in terms of systems development and demonstration, right, and sustainment, these sorts of things, right. Whereas most other DoD service organizations, right, are going to look closer to application, right? Look at higher technology readiness levels, things that are more ready and closer to implementation. Another way they define themselves. This is the diagrams in the case study, but it's also comes from DARPA's strategic plan. Is how they see themselves. Say, look, there's the vertical axis is sort of how much money is invested overall in these things. The horizontal axis is the time frame until the technology is ready for field application. And so there's a lot of things that are sort of, near-term applications, things that sort of investment supporting known requirements, right, that we hope to have in the field very quickly, right? But then there certainly are things that are concepts lying off existing roadmap. We don't know where they're going to go. We don't know what their application is. When we think about a roadmap, think about technology roadmaps. We see technology evolution, right? Going from from caveman to human or whatever. So this evolution of technologies. And that's sort of the roadmap. You sort of see where it's going. But there's certain things that are being sort of fundamental basic research, right? Concepts that we're not really sure what the application is going to be yet, right? But we're developing it, and eventually it might be game changing. It might be a dud. It might be nothing. And this idea of DARPA defines its scope by sort of building a bridge between the two, right? Connecting, the fundamental research that's off existing roadmap with, military requirements. And that's sort of where DARPA sort of sees itself. That's another way to define its scope. A third, if you will, or maybe it's fourth, fifth, or sixth, depending on how you think. Another way to define the scope is, this is actually from an article in the Harvard Business Review by a former DARPA director. Her name's going to come to me in a second. And she talked about how she talked about DARPA lives in what they call Pasteur's quadrant, right? This idea of, look, you can look at research in terms of whether there's a quest for fundamental understanding, right? You want the basic understanding of what's going on, in the world, right, or in the particular field you're looking at least, and also considerations of practical use. Do you actually care about that what you're doing has a practical application that can benefit society, etc.? There's some research that is up here in what they call Bohr's quadrant, after Niels Bohr, the atomic physicist, right? Pure basic research, right? Just trying to understand, not trying to figure out, how to make a bomb or how to solve disease or try to do anything like that, how to, make life better, develop a new phone or smartphone or technology, but just simply understand the structure of the atom. That is pure basic research, right? Wanting fundamental understanding, but not really worried about practical use. Over here in the lower right, we have Edison's quadrant. Think about Thomas Edison, and the idea that he was 100% focused on whether it's the phonograph or working with George Eastman on film and movies, or the light bulb, or all these sorts of things. The idea of how do you take what's already known, about electricity and other things, and actually create products that will improve life, that actually applied use, but not really necessarily worried about the fundamental understanding of how electricity works. Right? And in the lower left, actually, the initial article, the HBR article, didn't even, and her name is escaping me now, I've got to think about it, but didn't even label this, not labeled, but I've seen others label it Peterson's quadrant. Who's Peterson? Well, Peterson is actually somebody who published a lot of books about birds. Right? Now, so this is research. It is research, right? Going out and looking at birds, drawing pictures of them or taking photos of them and cataloging the different species of birds. There's not a fundamental understanding of trying to figure out the evolution of birds or why birds can fly or what makes the birds, feathers a particular color. There's no question of fundamental understanding. There's no real practical use, right? Knowing what birds are flying around, there's not a practical use that's going to affect your everyday life. So this is sort of but there is research in there. And where DARPA lives is Renee Duggan, that's her name. Renee Duggan wrote this article. Former DARPA director, Duggan. Where DARPA lives is in Pasteur's quadrant. Right? And they call it use-inspired basic research. And like Louis Pasteur, he did want to have a fundamental understanding, for example, of microorganisms, right? Bacteria and viruses and microorganisms, how they work and what the structures of the cells, etc. But ultimately, he wanted to have an application, right? We think about pasteurized milk, right? Pasteurized beer from last week in Coors, the Coors case study, right? That's because of Louis Pasteur. And so he wants to understand the microorganisms, but also have products that would protect us from infection, things like this. And so that's the idea of use-inspired basic research. And so one other way to define DARPA's scope is to say, look, it is to look at research that combines a quest for fundamental understanding with a consideration of practical use, as Louis Pasteur did, right? But not to be in the Bohr's quadrant and not to be in Edison's quadrant, or Peterson's, certainly. Right? And that's sort of this idea of another way to define DARPA scope. And so together, what I'm trying to point out to you is that you can define scope in many, many different ways. Certainly the most common ways are in terms of customer scope and needs-based positioning, as Porter talks about, product or service scope, variety-based positioning, to use Porter's language, or channel or location scope, a access-based positioning, to use Porter's language. But in general, the idea is defining what you do and what you don't do, right? In many different ways. There's many different ways you can define scope, and it could be dependent upon what your organization's purpose and the challenge that you're facing. And so DARPA, again, in their strategic plan, just reading even further strategic plan, they very explicitly talk about what they do and what they don't do, right? And they define their scope as really sort of filling a gap, right? It's not just what they're identifying a place where others in DoD research wouldn't do. And so it talks about DARPA emphasizes research that the services are unlikely to support because it is risky, it does not fit their specific role or missions, or it challenges existing systems or operational concepts. DARPA focuses on capabilities military commanders might want in the future, not what they know they want today. And DARPA insists that all programs start with the good ideas and good people to pursue them. Without both, DARPA will not start a program. So again, DARPA's strategic plan defines the challenge and then defines the scope, right? These are sort of telling about the type of technologies. This one is the type of technologies that they're going to solve. So that's sort of your variety. These are the customers, the capabilities, the applications, right? The future military capabilities that might be needed. That is the needs-based part of the positioning. And sort of part of the access-based positioning is how do you do it, the approach, right? Is we only will do, even if we have this application with this type of technology, we still won't do it unless we have good ideas and good people and good program managers in particular, that will allow us to have that. So this sort of DARPA, in their own strategic plan, defines a little bit about their needs-based, variety-based, and access-based positioning. All right, so that's the idea of scope. Right, and so so now we've really covered the why and the where, and we now got to the what. And this is sort of the second element, interestingly, the second element of the guiding policy that Brummel talks about, and the first part of the third element, right, or the advantage that's talked about in the reading on what can you say were your strategies in the elements of strategy statement. This is a good point to take a break. It's actually taken longer than I thought I would already, so we will stop here, and video part 2 will pick up right here at this point.